Good afternoon and welcome to the Ubuntu Dialogues webinar entitled Reimagining Ubuntu in the Post-Colony, Healing Force or the End of an Idea with Professor Lesley Le Grange and Professor Bernard Matolino. My name is Dr. Geraldine Freslar, Curator of Research, Dialogue and Social Justice at the Stellenbosch University Museum. And on behalf of the University Museum, it is my great privilege today to welcome the esteemed speakers and audience to the last Ubuntu Dialogues of a very eventful year. Just a little bit about the project itself before I give over to the program manager, Dr. Mariki Olofsson, who will introduce the speakers today. The Ubuntu Dialogues project is an international exchange program between the Michigan State University in the United States and Stellenbosch University in South Africa. The lead department at Michigan State is the African Studies Center, and at Stellenbosch University, the project is hosted by the Stellenbosch University Museum. The Seminar Exchange Program is one of three components of the project. Apart from the seminar exchanges, the Ubuntu Dialogue project also involves a student graduate fellowship and a series of conversations between students from Stellenbosch University and Michigan State University. Mr. Bongani Mkajima, also the director of the Stellenbosch University Museum, is the principal investigator at Stellenbosch University, and Mariki Olofsson is the project manager, as I mentioned. At Michigan State University, the principal investigator is Professor Jamie Monson, and the project manager is Dr. Upenyu Maji. Just to note that today is also Thanksgiving in the United States, and many of our colleagues, unfortunately, and also those who would usually have attended the Ubuntu Dialogues webinar may not be able to do so today. Thank you, Mariki. I give over to you.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, for that welcoming. I really appreciate that, that you are always willing to help out and assist with the webinars, despite your own schedule of just conversations. When Bongani Mkajima, he brought the article of Professor Le Grange under my attention, your article about Ubuntu Ukama and the healing of nature, self and society. And by that time, I have already been provoked by your article, Professor Matolino, about the end of Ubuntu and your misgivings about the way in which Ubuntu is used in the South African context. But before we get into the questions, and as we have agreed, we will keep it very conversational. And you have also kindly agreed that I can call you by your names. So we will pretend that we are sitting in three very nice relaxed chairs and just having a conversation. So thank you for that indulgence, and thank you for your time and for your willingness to be part of this last webinar this year. I'm going to start with introducing you, Professor Matolino. You are an associate professor in philosophy at the School of Religion, Philosophy and the Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Matolino's research interests are in African philosophy, political theory, and race and racism. His books include Personhood in African Philosophy, published in 2014, and he has published numerous journal articles on issues ranging from traditional African politics, South African philosophy, communitarian philosophy, racism, democracy, and of course, Ubuntu. Professor Le Grange is a distinguished professor in the Faculty of Education at Stellenbosch University. He has 237 publications to his credit and serves on editorial boards of 9 peer-reviewed journals. He has delivered 176 academic presentations, 70 as invited speaker, and is a recipient of several academic awards and prizes. In 2015, he was elected Fellow of the Royal Society of Biology in the UK And in 2019, he was elected a member of the Academy of Science of South Africa. In 2018, he was appointed member of the Council of Higher Education by the Minister of Higher Education, Science and Technology. And he is also a member of the Higher Education Quality Committee. After serving 2 terms as vice president, he was elected president of the International Association for the Advancement of Curriculum Studies in 2020. This year, he was appointed as a South African Council for Educators Councillor by the Minister of Basic Education. Professor Le Grange is rated as an internationally acclaimed researcher by the National Research Foundation. His current research interests include sustainability education, education in a post-humanist world, history of school biology in South Africa, the relationship between science and indigenous knowledge, Ubuntu as ecosophy or ecosophy, and its implications for education, curriculum change in South Africa, with reference to life sciences and environmental education, and decolonizing the university curriculum. Professor Le Grange, I'm going to start by asking you if you could perhaps help us with the pronunciation of ecosophy. I've struggled over that, no matter how many times I tried.
I think you did get it right once. I would just say ecosophy.
Ecosophy. So with that, I'm going to start with you, but I want to start by saying that the 2 articles, yours published in 2012 and Bernard's article with Wenceslaus Kwindingwi in 2013, put next to one another. At first, when you first read it, it seems that they are contradictory. But when you start to read them in more depth, I think they are saying similar things in a way. But I want to start with you, asking you, in the article that I'm referring to called Ubuntu, Ukama, and the Healing of Nature, Self, and Society, you propose Ubuntu as a potentially healing force of 3 ecologies: nature, self, and society. And I wonder if you can start by giving us a little bit of background behind the thinking of that article.
Thanks very much, Mariki, and thank you to Geraldine. It's certainly wonderful to be part of this conversation, and I'm happy that the format is a conversational one, and I'm so happy to be able to engage with Bernard today, and it was good to start reading his work, and I certainly look forward to reading a lot more in the future. So my earlier work was interested in decentering Western science, not to destroy it, so that it could be put on an imminent plane with all other ways of knowing, and therefore to give voice to indigenous ways of knowing. But as I journeyed and listened to people and critiques and criticisms that they had of Ubuntu, there was one that particularly interested me. And some colleagues, largely on international platforms, responded to claims that some had made that Ubuntu can serve as an environmental ethic. And their argument was that it can't, because by definition, if Ubuntu means relatedness among human beings, then by definition it is, they claim, speciesist. And that bothered me. So I started exploring that and believe that that is an error. That particular argument is an error, and I think it's good to start any academic work by viewing something as an error. If one looks at Ubuntu, which does refer to relatedness among human beings, there's a broader concept which is derived from an aphorism in the Shona language, mainly spoken in Zimbabwe, which is ukama. So its etymology is a lengthy one, but in simple terms, it refers to relatedness of everything in the cosmos. So my argument is that Ubuntu should be viewed as a concrete expression of ukama. So relatedness among human beings is actually a microcosm of the relatedness of everything in the cosmos. So when I engaged with the work of the philosopher Gilles Deleuze, and he worked and collaborated for many years with the psychoanalyst Felix Guattari, and Felix Guattari produced a book that was published in the late 1980s called The Three Ecologies. And he argued he's ecosophy, that's where the word comes in, that there are three interlocking domains. There's the domain of the social, that's relatedness amongst human beings. And then there is the domain of the self. And then there's also the domain which he called environment, but I would call that the more other than human world, that some people might refer to as non-human nature. And said that those are interlocking forces. And what integrated world capitalism is doing, we can use globalization as another word, with its technological arm. At the point he was writing, he referred to that as the mass media, but we can think about other technological arms in the digital world that we find ourselves in, was eroding the self, domesticating the self. And when you look at the domestication of the self, you have to understand things transversely. So the importance is transversal thinking. If you think transversely, when the self is eroded, you will also witness the erosion of kinship networks. And you would also view the destruction of non-human nature, or the more than human world. So my argument is suggesting that if that is the case, and I think Bernard's article points to, I think, the erosion of Ubuntu, not only because of colonialism and apartheid, but also because of how Ubuntu has been co-opted. We can talk about that in more detail later. So my argument is we should think about healing in the same way. So if we can understand destruction transversely, we need to understand healing transversely. So if we view the healing of the self, we can start with any of those registers or domains. That would lead to the healing of relationships between people, and it will also lead to a healing of relationships with a more than human world or non-human nature. So if Ubuntu is about relationality between human beings, and relationships between human beings can be strengthened and healed, it will effect healing of the self, and therefore healing of non-human nature or the more than human world. And in that sense, if you see Ubuntu as a microcosm of a bigger concept of relatedness of everything in the cosmos, to me, it could serve as an environmental ethic. Thank you, Mariki.
Thank you very much. So it's interesting to me that you sort of picked up on that the way that Bernard's argument about co-opting Ubuntu. So what I hear what you are saying is that you recognize that, that possibility of it being co-opted for a different purpose. So Bernard, if I can go to you, you raised specific questions about Ubuntu's restorative potential, as part of what you call the Ubuntuization of the intellectual, business, public and private lives in post-apartheid South Africa. So you focus on that bit. Can you give us some context of your misgivings about the use of Ubuntu as an instrument of cohesion or healing? And maybe we can then talk a little bit more about that cohesion, the possibilities for cohesion and healing after you give us the background behind your thinking.
Yes, thank you, Mariki, and thank you, Lesley, for your input and for the engagement, and also thanks to the organizers and to everybody who is here for taking an interest in this discussion. Well, it's important that I say a little bit about my co-author, because people ask me quite a bit about him. My co-author was our PhD candidate then, but he had some stuff to go and do in Europe, in Rome in particular, and he sort of suspended his academic pursuits. But that's what we came up with, and the reason why we came up with this piece was our shared misgivings on Ubuntu, its potential, its purpose, and what it was being used for, and who was using it. So it was pleasant then to find somebody, at least on my part, who had healthy suspicions of Ubuntu. But if I were to answer and speak for myself, because I've continued to do a bit of work on Ubuntu, and I'm interested in seeing how all these doubts around Ubuntu are going to lead to. I mean, for example, I agree with Lesley. In his paper, he tries to refute some doubts raised by people who think that Ubuntu is so anthropocentric it can't really do anything for non-humans. That's just not true, or at least it betrays a fundamental misunderstanding of the true nature of Ubuntu. So for me, I come from this view. I do think so. That forms part of the background as an answer to your question, Mariki. I come from the view that Ubuntu originates from two orientations or schools or commitments to the world. The first one is what we can call African communitarianism, which is also an area I work in, which emphasizes the importance of relations, ukama, which Lesley was talking about, as well as the importance of the community in determining the status of the individual. You could call it a metaphysical, an epistemological, or even an ethical standing of the individual. Then the second school orients itself towards what I call a certain kind of retrievalist orientation. And what do I mean by retrieval? It's an orientation that acknowledges the forcefulness of the disruption caused by episodes of colonialism, slavery, apartheid, neocolonialisms, etc., etc. These disruptions were so severe that the African is said to have lost his or her identity as a direct result of these disruptions. And in the quest to rediscover, reorient himself or herself, the African has got to dig deep into his or her roots to discover what the authentic African really was. Once that authentic African is discovered and accordingly retrieved and animated, that idea of who or what an African is may be able to guide the African going forward, both healing himself or herself, and secondly, developing attitudes and orientations about the present, the past, and the future. So those are the two things that were very key to my thinking. And in the broad analysis of those two key informants of Ubuntu. Firstly, I'm dissatisfied by those two propositions, but most importantly, when I zoom into Ubuntu, not only do I find it to share some weaknesses that are found in these propositions, but it has got its own peculiar weaknesses. And I'm interested in two countries here, South Africa and Zimbabwe, which have publicly punted Ubuntu as a working solution. And my reservation is that the imposition of Ubuntu on the intellectual, political, and moral scene, or if you are not happy with the word imposition, such a forceful revival of Ubuntu lacks a full appreciation of the journey that the African has been on. And it conveniently chooses to tell only one part of a pseudo-romanticized account of what an African is. It's a problem that's there in literature. I don't want to bore you with literature, but it's a problem that's there in literature, which presents the African as a warm, always welcoming, almost always forgiving, understanding, sociable, highly genial, cooperative being. And I have trouble with some of those assumptions. And I think I may stop here.
Thank you very much. So I want to go back to you, Lesley. So you acknowledge in your article that there's a breakdown of what you call, and I quote, kinship networks and associated cultural values with a concept like Ubuntu. So I wonder how would you respond to Bernard's notion of that maybe those kinship networks and associated cultural values with Ubuntu is a romanticized view of what it means to be African?
I actually don't have much disagreement with Bernard. So I think your observation is probably correct. If you looked at the two articles at face value, then you probably might come to the conclusion that that in a sense our positions are contradictory. So my reading of what Bernard is saying is, I think he's arguing against some essentialist notion of African, and that the idea that there is some there's a mode of life that we can retrieve and discover that's almost untainted by any other influences, and that there were not any other influences. If that is certainly my one reading, and that the other reading would be that Ubuntu, and I use the words, and Bernard might not agree with it, that Ubuntu has become co-opted for particular political agendas, and he argues very well how Ubuntu has been used as narratives of return by South African political leaders, or also the Black elite. So it includes people in the academy, as well as, of course, similar narratives when it came to leadership of other African leaders, and also in the sense that Ubuntu has also almost become sloganized. That it's useful as a political slogan, and then it has also been co-opted by the corporate world and by the business world. So I would certainly find all of that problematic. So I'm actually in agreement with Bernard. What I want to perhaps ask Bernard, which sort of interests me, as I read the particular article, Bernard was sometimes opening up for me and then closing and perhaps opening up, and I'm not sure the possibility of reimagining Ubuntu. And I wanted to know from him was his argument foreclosing any possibility of reimagining Ubuntu, or was he leaving that question open? That's what I wanted to ask him. And maybe let me then say what my own position would be there. So I think Ubuntu, one obviously needs to speak about it as a particular mode of life. And of course, Bernard's argument is that there were particular conditions that produced Ubuntu, culturally, historically, and so on. So I do understand that. But I also want to look at Ubuntu as a philosophical concept. And to me, broadly, there are two kinds of concepts. There are concepts that we call concepts of recognition. So I can look at an object and we can, by agreement, say that that object is a tree, it's a flower, it's a table. That's a concept of recognition. But philosophical concepts are vital concepts. They're concepts that are always in becoming. So they don't have fixity. Because certainly if the world has changed and there have been lots of influences in African life, then concepts can be created and recreated to have transformative effects in a contemporary world. So that would be my argument that I see the possibilities of reimagining Ubuntu. And I can talk a little bit later about how we might see that in a sense to Bernard's argument around our current narratives of Ubuntu are affecting citizens. So I think I'll stop there.
I want to jump in here, Bernard, because what I hear Lesley is asking, and you can, Lesley, correct me if I'm wrong, and because that was what I was wondering about that as well. So in sort of that provocative statement of the end of Ubuntu, do you leave a space for reimagining it as something else?
Yes, thank you, colleagues. Yes, I knew that the agreement was only going to last this long. Because when I read Lesley's paper, I thought he was very optimistic and hopeful. I mean, I'm grateful that you know, he concedes the sort of obvious things that we share. And then this is where the trouble now starts. And I agree. What we present there looks like our real target is an essentialist. So those who have followed the debate will know that one of the most prominent philosophers in this country who support Ubuntu, Thaddeus Metz, currently at the University of Pretoria, immediately jumped in after we wrote that article. And he said, I think their target was me because I've written a lot about Ubuntu. So we didn't mention anybody, and he's not going to be an essentialist. He does exactly what Lesley is asking for, reimagining Ubuntu. And he's got these beautiful principles on how he can rebuild a theory of Ubuntu, how he suggests that he is sufficiently theorized philosophically, as Lesley demands, that there should be philosophical conceptualization. And he says, boom, I provide philosophical conceptualization there. But like all good philosophers will do, somebody springs up and says, this is absolutely wrong. And I also joined the debate. I say, some of the stuff that you're saying is just your view. And so I say, from his surname, I say this is Metzian theory. It's no longer Ubuntu theory. Now, here's the real problem, Lesley. How do non-essentialists and progressive scholars of Ubuntu escape from Ubuntu, right? non-essentialists? How do they escape from Ubuntu? Now, this may sound like a queer question, but it's not. You see, if we're talking about Ubuntu, we're looking at a few core fundamentals that you must not depart from. So there are certain requirements that must be met or that must be fulfilled for any orientation to be called Ubuntu, be it political, social, or ethical. Now, these fundamental commitments, at least theoretically, pin down the agency of Blackness to a few core things. If you won't depart radically from those core requirements, then you're still in agreement with that unnamed individual that we had in mind when we wrote that paper. Because if you stray too far, then you're not doing Ubuntu anymore. That's the first point. What were we doing? Were we opening or closing the debate on Ubuntu? That's a very important question. And it has been interpreted differently from people who have reacted to that paper. One person whom I like very much as a scholar and as an individual says, methodologically we were correct. We managed to raise everything to ground zero. And he says it's a methodology that he likes. However, he says we were unable to do damage to Ubuntu. Somebody says we missed the boat completely, both methodologically and substantively. Somebody says, interestingly, is also a critic of Ubuntu. Somebody says, oh, our hunch was correct, but our language was crass. So it's like our language was a beaten school. It needs to go back to school. So you can see all these reactions show that the question you are asking is very pertinent. And I think I should give a frank answer today. Our aim was really to finish Ubuntu completely. Why? Because we believe very seriously, and we share that commitment that you have. This is why it bothers me that then we differ in our conclusions. What commitment do I share with you? Lesley, I share this commitment seriously, that humanity is perpetually unfolding, and humanity is able to shape and reshape things, including reshaping Ubuntu and rethinking Ubuntu. However, I do think that a lot has gone on theoretically and practically to make Ubuntu not the most plausible mode of interpreting African existence, or one can say the phenomenology of being African. I mean, I could ask this question. What does it mean to be an African today, in Africa in general, but let's say in Zimbabwe and South Africa in particular? Whatever the answer is, we could push the metaphor a bit forward and say, does Ubuntu succeed in capturing whatever reported experiences or even thinking about what it is to be African? And of course, there's room for Ubuntu. Some people may say, of course it does. If Ubuntu cannot capture with precision what Africans are experiencing now, it can at least tell us something about what an idealized version of existence is. And that's at home with ethics. And that's fine, that's fair. The only problem is that all theorization about Ubuntu starts with the practicalities of Ubuntu. And it is at that level of the practicalities of Ubuntu where the African life is no longer in accord with the harmony that Ubuntu first requires for there to be sustainable societies. But the African life now is basically precarious and almost endangered by a number of forces, homegrown forces, externally generated forces, some shared with the rest of humanity, some not so shared with the rest of humanity. So we thought that Ubuntu as a conceptual handle of African existence and experience was somewhat not only falling short, but was also beginning to present a danger to thinking itself, which you and I have agreed that is important, to reimagination. Why should we always reimagine things in accord with Ubuntu? That's where the essentialism comes in for me. Why can't I, you see, many people say to me, yeah, but you say this because you're a liberal. And I hate that because I'm not. I say to them, I am the strongest advocate of freedom. And freedom should not be claimed by liberals only. Anybody can claim freedom. And communitarians are so reluctant to accept that freedom is part of the package of communitarianism. So they try to play it down and say, yeah, we're free, but the most important thing is that we're free in association with others. I'm free as I can be on my own, and I can be part of a community, but never say I must surrender my freedom. So it becomes like an intellectual and conceptual scene. If you want to reimagine African life outside the parameters of Ubuntu, it's almost as if you have failed to understand Ubuntu completely, therefore you are a bad person. It's only that I'm looking for other possibilities. I mean, in one of my works, Afro-Communitarian Democracy, I spend a lot of time trying to demonstrate that there is a certain version of communitarianism which is not necessarily in accord with Ubuntu, but it's still communitarianism. So we really wanted to finish it, but it looks like we did not succeed. Why? Because we thought there were other modes of imagining African life that were there. And on your philosophical conceptualization, and I think here, philosophy has got both an advantage and a disadvantage. Philosophy is supposed to shed light on stuff. But how sharp that light is, I don't know. Why? Because philosophers have got a tendency not to agree on anything. So let's take a poor guy, and I do that in my response to Mets. Let's take a poor guy from Limpopo. At that time, I used an example of an old lady. But today, let's take a poor guy from Limpopo who says to himself, I really want to understand what Ubuntu is. And I have heard that the best guys to explore Ubuntu and to articulate coherently on Ubuntu are philosophers. And this guy goes to the nearest library, gets all the relevant literature on Ubuntu written by philosophers, sits behind a desk for a whole month, reads these philosophers thoroughly. What version of Ubuntu is he going to emerge with? He will be more confused at the end of his readings than he was before he embarked on this reading. Why? Because philosophers attack each other's concept of Ubuntu. They disagree on what the building blocks for legitimate Ubuntu is. And they just are so unkind to each other's theorization, but we all accept it comes with the job, which now leaves me with only one thing. How can we assess Ubuntu? And I say Ubuntu now can be assessed in a compartmentalized way. There's a philosophical assessment of Ubuntu. There's a political assessment of Ubuntu. There is a social assessment of Ubuntu. And whether these, and everything else, others have got legal assessments of Ubuntu, transitional capacities of assessment of Ubuntu, etc. Whether all these can speak to each other coherently, I do not know. I leave that to my hopeful brother Lesley to tell us if we ever do that.
Lesley, you're welcome to respond.
So yeah, so I shall respond briefly. Thanks for that, Bernard. So in the 2012 work which I did, I was responding to particular critiques of Ubuntu. And so in responding to those criticisms, one does take a particular stronger position. But I think we are a little more closer than you might think, because I certainly don't want to view Ubuntu as any kind of totalizing narrative, that this is the big answer to solving, and certainly would have no issues with saying that Ubuntu is one particular mode of life and understanding we can draw on, and together with other modes of life, and look at how they can work together in new knowledge spaces, where we can produce new knowledge and new ways of being and becoming. But if we look at, I think we're also in agreement to say that if one looks at the African condition, which you describe in detail, that there certainly has been a destruction or erosion of Ubuntu, and that's reflected in various aspects of Africa's current condition. But if we find ourselves currently in a country that is a microcosm of the world, and we see that inequality is growing, poverty is increasing, that we're on the brink of ecological disaster, I certainly believe we can find inspiration from the notion of Ubuntu in talking to contemporary issues. And not in the way that it should be used as a political narrative by the political elite and those who are powerful. I think it could play an important role in inspiring new modes of living that begin in local places, that we reimagine how we can live and how we can live ethically, and that it can inspire social movements across the world, not only in Africa, as it already is doing with social movements in other places like in Latin America and so on, to connect people around common experiences that they have of an ongoing global colonial matrix of power. So, yeah, that would be my brief response.
Thank you, Lesley. That's a lovely way to sort of get us into the last 15 minutes of this engagement before we get the audience to involved as well. And I can see there are a lot of questions and responses, because it feels to me as if what you have described now is a way of sort of getting into that real question about what does it mean as a way of being, as a way to live. What does it tell us about how we live our lives? And Bernard, you used that lovely phrase, as a way of being committed to the world. And I'm saying that, and I do not want to sound like being like the romantic, like being over-optimistic about just using the word Ubuntu, because sometimes it feels to me that if you just say the word Ubuntu, then, you know, it all becomes, as the students, one of the Ubuntu Dialogue student graduates say, then we all become all kumbaya. So, and I actually think that Ubuntu is really a radical concept. It is a radical, it requires some radical rethinking of how we are committed to the world and how we are committed to one another. And see our relationships to other people. So I wonder then, Bernard, if I can ask you, so if you say that it was the end, that you were actually talking about finishing it, as you say, then what do you propose, or is there something, or what do you propose then as a way to navigate out of this, what you call the morass that appears to accompany the notion of Ubuntu? What takes us then out of that? What is the alternative concepts, values, philosophies? Can you talk a little bit about how you see that? What is the reimagination there?
In that paper, we sort of signal that kind of imagination. I must say, maybe that was a bad signal at that stage. The real issue that I have with Ubuntu, and if I can start just by responding a little bit to Lesley and then come directly to your question. You see, even if you were to think of Ubuntu as a reimagination and the dynamic and the radical commitment to the world, there's some bits and pieces that are attached to Ubuntu which make me doubt how thoroughgoing this radical feature of Ubuntu would be. Lesley picked up a very good word, and I like that word, ukama. And I read Mrowe's things, whom you quoted, because Mrowe was the authority on ukama. And I know Shona, fortunately. So I understand the word beyond the description itself. I almost have like a soil understanding of the word. If I say to Lesley, there is ukama between you and me, and I say to Mariki, there is no ukama between you and me, it's not just saying that we're not related. It almost means something to the effect that there is no commitment between you and me, beyond just recognition that you are there and I'm there. Lesley will sort of take priority over you because there is this ukama between him and I. What is my point? Ukama is not a concept that is applicable to everybody from an agent's perspective. Ukama essentially means I exclude those that I'm not related to, and I concentrate first and foremost on those that I'm related to. And this makes me wonder, what's radical about such a view, which is discriminatory in its nature, because that's what it is. So I've had large problems with Mrowe's conceptualization of ukama and how selectively ukama has been used as if it is an umbrella term that talks about how everybody is related to everybody. That's not the case. There is no such generic relatedness that exists. This is why Kwindingwi and I, and that's one of the foundations of the Shona equivalent of Ubuntu, which is Hunu. To be recognized as a person, there should be some kind of attribute that you display that is liked by the other. And that used to happen in communities that emphasized mutual recognition amongst members. And as we know, mutual recognition amongst members of a given community is reinforced by exclusion of people who do not belong to that community. So it's tricky for me if we look at the things that underlie Ubuntu. Now, coming to your question, why our reimagination was about humans, I think what's important is not so much what we think Africa can lecture the world about, because I hear that a lot. Many people are eager to say Africa can teach the world something through its concept of Ubuntu. And it's never clear to me what it is that's being referred to there. What is it that we're teaching the world through Ubuntu? Indeed, there are many attributes that can be said to be positive about Ubuntu, but I think there are other things that human beings who are interested in the advancement of humanity, like we've never known before, may just as well come up with theories that accommodate all those who are oriented towards certain core fundamentals of how humans should be treated everywhere and how humans should also behave in their environment. You spoke very well about the dangers that face us as human beings, the ecological dangers, and I could add to that my favorite topic of race and racism, and for some of us who live this side of the world, economic threats that are always ever present. The reimagination that we have in mind is one that takes the value of being human seriously and not seeing a human being for a small part in an equation. I think a human being in Ubuntu is a small part in the equation of Ubuntu. A human being is never fully valued as a human being in Ubuntu. That's my thinking. Remember what is the most important thing there? It's the community, it's the society. A human being is in service of the good of the community. Now, I'm not saying a human being must be taken as valued in the individualistic liberal type of sense, but there is a certain value, particularly here in Africa, that has been so violated through political violence, social violence, economic depravity, etc., that the human is almost dehumanized. And once again, what's given the human is just the moral aspect. Oh, but your capacity to be good. That's the reimagination. I'm sorry if it's not very clear. It's also not very clear in my head, but at least I know that it won't be led by Ubuntu. Yes.
So Mariki, can I ask Bernard a question?
Sure.
So when I read your article, you sort of arguing against an essentialist notion of what an African is, or an African mode of life. But are you not do you not also have an essentialist notion of the concepts of Ubuntu and Ukama that they can't have value and meaning outside of that actual situated context that produced the concepts?
Theoretically, it's possible. Theoretically, it's possible. One can do it and recognize others as standing as equivalent with an NTS of an agent whom they would recognize as constituting a relationship of Ukama. It's possible. However, this is what we also know about relatedness in as far as Ukama is concerned. It allows you to go so far and you can't complete that journey. It's like totemism. Another good example. If you are not a lion and you are a monkey, your totem is monkey. Even the jokes that lion people tell about monkey people, they can be uncharitable sometimes, but we take it as part of the social collectivism. But I read a bit more than that in the superiorization of one over the other. And some people have spoken in the context of, have written in the context of Zimbabwe, how that taking away of the humaneness of the other happens. For example, one could refer to in the language, I mean, it's a rough translation. One could refer to a white person as not a person. One could refer to Ndebele as not a person and speak as if the Shona people were only persons. So he could say, there was an accident and 3 people died, as well as 1 Ndebele and 1 white. Now, why do you say 1 Ndebele and 1 white? And it's acceptable linguistic expression, but it also shows you some kind of epistemological and ontological things that are going on, I think. And one mustn't take those things not so seriously, because they've got an impact now in how one orients themselves towards the world. that's at least what's problematic about me. But theoretically, it's possible. We can say I overcome barriers, I do all these things. But my question will be: is Ubuntu the best tool to take us there, considering other underpinning commitments that it brings to the table? Whether those commitments are openly acknowledged or not, some of us are always suspicious of underlying capacity. Yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Mariki?
Yes.
But can I also ask Lesley a question, if you don't mind, quickly?
Sure.
What do you envision any non-essentialist reading of Ubuntu bringing to the global table? What would be its important instruction? And most importantly, what would be so attractive about it that it would be epistemically acceptable to people who've never engaged in this stuff? What would make them say, voila, I'm a convert, I'm following this stuff?
My view is not to be evangelical at all. No, I'm certainly not evangelical, but you would agree that in other traditional indigenous societies, there are similar notions and concepts.
Yeah.
That enables a conversation in transnational spaces that can actually happen. Now, I mean, and you as a philosopher would know that very, very well. So we haven't spoken about power at all. But broadly speaking, we can talk about two kinds of notions of power. So there is power that is hierarchical, that imposes, that colonizes, but there's also a productive power. And that's a power that connects, that is immanent, that doesn't transcend practices and engagements. And in some senses, I see Ubuntu as linked to the unfolding of a human being, and that the human being unfolds in relationship with other human beings and the more than human world. If that power of potential can be harnessed by social movements opposed to the dominant and hegemonic powers that we do see in our society, there's the possibility of a grassroots movement that can challenge ways in which Ubuntu and other notions have become eroded and corrupted and co-opted in all kinds of ways. And I think that there's potential inspiration there for a grassroots movement transnationally, where people are able to connect with each other and share in common, not only common experiences, but also in similar notions that others do as part of their lived experiences in other spaces similar to Ubuntu.
I want to extend this conversation to the audience because I can see there's a lot of interest there, and I'm going to transfer to Geraldine immediately to moderate the comments and the question and Q&A session. Geraldine.
Thanks, Mariki. I'll start off with a question that came in via email first, because that was our very first question. And it's addressed to Professor Matolino. Let me just try and find her name. Anita Jonker asked Professor Matolino that she recently attended a webinar on Ubuntu where she got the impression from the speaker that Ubuntu is exclusively available to African indigenous people and that white people cannot achieve Ubuntu. And then she goes on to say that Professor Pumla Gobodo Madikizela differed from the speaker and said that she has a more inclusive understanding of Ubuntu, but that then she learned from a Black Christian colleague of hers that he attended another seminar where the speaker had the view that this exclusivity also applies to Black Christians who do not uphold African indigenous practices anymore. And she sometimes gets the impression that the indigenous knowledge and decolonization debates at universities unintentionally undermine a human rights culture that is not limited to one specific culture, religion, or continent. This applies especially to the rights of individuals who do not conform to the traditional norms of the ideal African community. And I guess she's referring to you, Professor, that your reference to Minister Teles, who lamented the taxi driver's lack of Ubuntu, exonerates the politician from accountability to create the conditions for his understanding of Ubuntu. But despite your justified criticism, I still find value in Kize and Karenga's positive understandings of Ubuntu mentioned in your article. And I find those values are in her relationship with others, especially in dealing with the dire consequences of apartheid. So that's quite long. So question. So I will leave that one first for you to chew on, and if Professor Le Grange also wants to jump in.
Okay, no, that's fine. I'm sympathetic to the second part of the question about individuals who differ with the grain and then are condemned. I'm very sympathetic to that kind of understanding of the situation. But to the first part of the question, the two speakers that she listened to differed because of a very simple reason. Their commitment was informed and shaped by what they understood Ubuntu to be. Some people understand Ubuntu as a theoretical concept. So it's a concept, it's just a concept. We can get what the values of Ubuntu are, we can talk about them, and we can test those values against other dominant ethical forms of thought, such as utilitarianism and deontology. And you find that going on in the work of Thaddeus Metz, for example. His opponent, Mogobe Ramose, and these are both philosophers, on the other hand, says Ubuntu is larger than just ethical theorization. Yes, we can do the ethical theoretical part, but there are also other commitments that come with Ubuntu. So it's also a metaphysics, it's also an ontology, it's also an epistemology. That's why I thought Lesley was right on the ball in his critique of those people whom he talks about in his paper, who fail to understand that Ubuntu is not just a set of principles about how human beings should treat each other. Ubuntu is a lot more than that. If I treated people around me very well, but I treated my animals very, very badly, people around me may begin to question me. They might have a certain disliking for me, and they may even reduce my standing as a human being. So the difference you clearly see is informed by what each thinker was orienting themselves towards in their understanding of Ubuntu. So, for example, Ubuntu is not just about human beings who are alive here on earth. It's also about my ancestors. So it's about, what do I do for my ancestors every year? Do I slaughter for them? Do I maintain cordial relations with them? I'll be hard pressed to find a white person who accepts tenets of Ubuntu up to a point where they'll start slaughtering for their ancestors. I mean, I've yet to come across such incidents. So if there are white people who like Ubuntu, or like principles or moral or ethical principles of Ubuntu, but are not prepared to go the ontological route of maintaining cordial relations with with ancestors because they don't think such entities exist, then someone may say, and I do understand it, I'm not saying I support it, I do understand where that person will be coming from. Then that person will say, no, but this is not the complete story about Ubuntu. We are leaving out a very important aspect about our relationship with the unseen and those who are yet to come. Yeah, I think that will be my response. Yes, thank you.
So one from the chat box is, can the speakers explain how or why Ubuntu and corporate capitalism are not good bedfellows? And is Lesley suggesting that Ubuntu might well be a traveling concept that, let me just scroll down a little bit, that might well address post-humanist critique of its anthropological disposition? And then just one more from the Q&A box is, could we also please get the citations of the speakers' articles that they are referring to posted in the chat? Maybe that's something that Mariki can assist with later.
So can I respond to, I think, the second part of the question? I think, like Bernard said, in a philosophical sense, the concept is able to travel. Now, I do find it productive because there are other discourses emerging, and they do have influence. They're northern or western discourses, and so there's lots of discourses on post-humanism, for example. And so within Western society, there are people that are questioning this notion of the ideal human being, man, the measure of all things. And so there's a whole set of, there are lots of literature and thinking being produced on this. And I think there can be a productive conversation between post-human thought and traditional African and other thoughts, whether it be Chinese and so on, about how we think about the human being in the contemporary world. What is the unit of reference of a human being in the temporary world, given our understanding and insights from Ubuntu and people that are producing post-human theories, is suggesting that that we shouldn't think about the human as isolated in any way, but the human as being ecological, not atomistic, and that we shouldn't be privileging epistemology in our conversations, but we should be talking about ethico-onto epistemology. Now, I think there are obviously differences in these discourses, but there are also commonalities where you could have productive conversations. So, yeah, so I've done some work on this elsewhere, but yeah, time won't allow me to explore that in, I think, in detail.
Do you have the next question, Geraldine?
Sure. The next question is in the Q&A section, and it's from Nathan. Professor Bernard, I share your misgivings about how Ubuntu is being used to romanticize, to promote a notion of the African as warm, welcoming, etc. To what extent has this enabled neoliberals to appropriate the notion of Ubuntu in pursuit of the neoliberal agenda? And then if I jump to the chat box, David asked, what do the two Ubuntu from a critical realist, in brackets, not essentialist and constructionist framework, perspective across disciplines and context, Ubuntu, number one, Ubuntu exists whether we recognize it or not. In both cases, it is transformed through cultural, religious, and other practices in everyday life. The problem is that what we think about our own identities and transformation, and this question is addressed to both speakers. Thank you.
Yes, I'll talk about how Ubuntu is appropriated in the neoliberal agenda. Well, I don't know, quite frankly. I would also say, I'm not sure what the neoliberal agenda is. I'm sure there is one, and I'm sure it is interested in hijacking as many things as possible to make them tailor well with whatever its agenda is. I mean, I've seen how for example, some places which are ordinarily hostile to things that come from Africa are quite welcoming when it comes to Ubuntu. So I do not know what the agenda of those places are or what they're trying to do with Ubuntu. But what I can tell you is that if people will live in spaces where Ubuntu is said to originate from, like us, we live in that space. If we're not rigorous enough about our own concept, and if we do not think through it carefully, including opening it up to critique, it will be appropriated by other people, and it may emerge in another form, looking much better or much stronger than what we started off with. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. I do not know. Whether it's a liberal agenda or not, I do not know. But I think our conversations must be comfortable with criticism as well. I mean, in some places you are exercised immediately if you try to criticize things on Ubuntu. As to the second question, I'm not very comfortable with its basic premise that whether we agree or not, Ubuntu exists. I mean, all we have to do is to look around us, and if we're convinced that our daily life, or what at least is reported in the papers, and what we experience and what we see and what we've been victims of, is evidence of the existence of Ubuntu, that's fine. But I'm not inclined to go that route. What I'm inclined to say is that there are pockets of society where Ubuntu is viable because the basic resources that enable its practice remain intact. But there are also pockets of society which are so severely broken, so severely broken, that Ubuntu is no longer plausible either as an idea or as a way of living. Thank you.
So that's actually interesting. So the pockets where Ubuntu is thriving and exists, there's also, of course, a danger that can become destroyed and eroded. So it's a question to Bernard, but you don't have to answer it. So if we make an argument for doing away with Ubuntu, aren't we foreclosing on the possibilities of those pockets to thrive and the possibility of some kind of indigenous futurity? Would be a question to ask. But I'm in agreement that Ubuntu, like when we win the Rugby World Cup, we believe that all South Africans are, somehow united and together. And as in Brazil, the same thing. Brazilians only believe they're all Brazilians when their soccer team sort of plays. And it becomes a form of also silencing people with a false sense and a myth of togetherness. And Ubuntu, of course, has been co-opted and used in such ways that you can dish it out sometimes as a response to not addressing the real deep problems of South Africa, when you're just sloganizing it as the police minister has done, and so on. But if we do foreclose on the possibilities of an indigenous futurity, then do we get to the point by saying that, like Fukuyama has argued, that it's the end of history, and that capitalism has won, and that we should just embrace, rampant capitalism? I'm sure we're not saying that should be the case at all. But what about the possibility of an indigenous future, and where those pockets are, that opportunities for that to thrive? in a democracy like South Africa.
And what you are asking, Lesley, of course, has implications also for your suggestion of using it as an indigenous knowledge system in curriculum studies, but there's not time. We will make another opportunity to talk about that and the complexities around that. Geraldine, do you have another question?
But can I say something just briefly about, because there's not sort of time. So there's been lots of conversations in South Africa about decolonizing, the curriculum. And that's an ongoing conversation. Now, there are many things that we use when we do our work in education. So people might use books. They might say that there are things like essays and assessments, and there's a lecturer, and there are many things. That is never the substance of what curriculum is, but something that it can inspire the work and engagement that we actually have with students. And in many ways, I've suggested not that the curriculum work that we're doing in any way mimics Ubuntu, but we can be inspired by Ubuntu to do a lot more, to do different and transformative pedagogy. And yeah, so that's what I would have spoken about, but I think we should move to the questions.
One question from the Q&A section is from Anonymous, who is just wondering on what international critics say about Ubuntu, that Ubuntu cannot act meaningfully in terms of holism during including the environment. Do they fairly and equally raise the critique of all humanisms and human-centered political systems where those critics find themselves, for example, in the West? Or is this a critique they raise solely of African humanism in the form of Ubuntu? Are they possibly holding African philosophies to a higher standard than their own Western philosophies? And then another question is Ubuntu in the blood or inherent in African indigeneity? And a final question for this round is, P. Simba finds Professor Matolino's reading of Ukama very problematic. It sees Ukama as somehow disconnected from Ubuntu. The first fundamental of Ubuntu is the premium placed on the human and the deservingness of the human to be seen or acknowledged, to be in relationship, even in potentiality. Hence the isiZulu greeting, Sakubona, we see you, is an important marker of this notion, relationality. Thank you.
So maybe I'll take the first question. So there have been post-human scholars that have characterized Ubuntu as an African humanism. But scholars like Ramosi have been helpful to say that Ubuntu is not humanism and is actually opposed to humanism and any other kind of ism. So I would say that is an imposition from Western scholars. But Ubuntu is about an unfolding and about a becoming. It's an ontological concept. So I would say, yes, that is certainly an imposition that Western scholars have made by claiming that Ubuntu is an African humanism. Bernard, I think the last question was addressed to you, but I think you would probably better be able to address question 2 as well.
I thought they were both for you. Can you please repeat the last question?
I think the last question was specifically for you.
About Ukama.
Was it I thought it was a comment. I mean, I'm convinced that Ukama and Ubuntu are not one and the same thing. The Shona people have got a specific word for Ubuntu. It's Unu or Unu. So if there's a word for that, then how can they be one and the same thing? I mean, I understand Ukama to be, Murove himself is in person and in his writings, explained it as relationality. Ubuntu encompasses and would also encompass relationality. But Morove's thinking was always that there is need to explain that relationality on its own, you know, as the most important constitutive element of what Wunu is. So Ukama is what I have with you as my, maybe as they would call it in English, significant other, but not romantically. You know, like you're my significant other. If I'm related to you, it could be my brother, you could be, you see. So when I gather with my siblings, we immediately invoke our totem, you know, and my friends are immediately excluded there. So that's how I understand it. But I mean, the question could have a different meaning. I thought it was a comment. Sorry, that's why I was slightly confused. Thank you.
Geraldine, we have about 3 minutes or so, 3-4 minutes before we need to conclude. So maybe you can bear that in mind with the next round of questions.
Sure. There was a hand raised earlier by Ruti, and where I'm hopeful that his question was answered now by your further explanation of Ukama. So I will move to the next question that he also asked, which was for Professor Matolino. Do you think that Ubuntu can be a theological philosophy anchored in humanity and possibly the embracement of God in nature? Oh, there's a question for Professor Le Grange. Can you talk a little bit more about Ubuntu Kurere as a decolonizing force? I hope I pronounced that correctly. And then a final question for both of you. What type of economic system in or for Africa would an understanding of Ubuntu bring forth? Does the application of Ubuntu to economics move us into a space where we can avoid using the word or concepts capitalism or socialism to articulate the economic philosophies? I must say that the chat box is exploding. So I will leave you with those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy.
Well, to the first question, whether Ubuntu can be a philosophical, theological humanity raised in nature with references to God, the simple answer is yes. Indeed, the many people who have written precisely along the same lines. But also what's important to emphasize is that those writings are normally a rehabilitative exercise, which tries to demonstrate that the African has got rational concepts which can explain things rationally. They're not fuzzy commitments, but that's fine. So the simple answer is yes, and I think Ubuntu should do that. And the question on the economic system that Ubuntu could possibly be committed to, we raised the same question in the paper that is under discussion. We really wondered what its other commitments beyond the beautiful ethical stuff will be. You know, we live in a rough world, and when I was a youngster, when I was about 18, I was already reading Marx. And Marx was telling me then that the economy is the most important structure. Everything else that follows is a reflection of the economy. So if we don't have serious comments about what the appropriate economic structure that Ubuntu wants to have would be, then we will be in trouble. So I agree with that question. Proponents of Ubuntu really need to think holistically beyond the ethical, beyond the beautiful, into hardcore stuff. How do we deal with the attention that Africa is getting from China and America and her allies? Do we remain just nice and saying they are our whatever, and we should speak to them nicely? I don't know, but it's a key question. Thank you.
I'll answer the question on Ubuntu Kurere. So currere is the Latin root for where we get the word curriculum from. But there's also a Grecian understanding of curriculum, which means it's a chariot track. So it's something that's mapped out already. And that has become the dominant way in which we think about curriculum. So we plan ahead and map out the pathway that students must follow, which has a normalizing and homogenizing effect, driven by things like assessment and so on in schools and in university. But the Latin meaning currere means to flow, to run. So it gives you the sense of the unfolding notion of a human being, the becoming of pedagogical lives. And when you understand that notion of curriculum, so it severs curriculum from this idea that we all should follow the same path and it's mapped out before the time. And that has some resonance with the notion of Ubuntu as unfolding, the unfolding of the human being and opening up multiple pathways for the becoming of the pedagogical lives. So in my work, I've combined those notions to make us rethink about curriculum and the dominant forms of curriculum that are prevalent in both schools and universities.
Geraldine, I don't know if there's anything a last urgent question that you see, or if I would like to keep to the time if it is possible, but if there's anything urgent.
No, thank you, Mariki. I think we've managed to address hopefully everybody's questions. And thank you so much for all the comments and for the interactive discussion as well. Apologies to the audience that we couldn't also get through some of the comments that may be helpful to the professors.
Thank you, Geraldine. We will obviously share with the audience and with the presenters the chat file. And if we get, you are welcome to send me more questions that you have for the presenters or just in general, and I will forward it to them. And we also do hope to continue this conversation, which clearly is a very complex conversation, not a one-dimensional conversation throughout the course of next year and in 2023, running in the run-up to 2 conferences, one in South Africa and one in the US that we are planning as part of concluding this Ubuntu Dialogues project. So we do hope, Lesley and Bernard, that you would be available again for more conversations. I want to conclude by this idea of becoming that I often hear when people talk about Ubuntu is something that I find fascinating. And one of the Ubuntu Dialogue Seminar Exchange Fellows, Dr. Motsamai Molefe, talks about a broader infrastructure that needs to be in place institutionally, state-wise, education-wise, health-wise, that would allow, that makes space for me to become a person through another person. So that's also an interesting concept, sort of to think about that wider, real infrastructure that needs to be in place. I want to thank all the people who attended this last webinar, the concluding webinar of an exciting program of 2021. Thank you for those who supported the webinars throughout the year. We really, we are encouraged by the interest in this work, and it looks like a lot of people who are prepared to do that reimagining, rethinking of concepts like these. That is one of the objectives of this project. So thank you very much for your support throughout the year. To you, Professor Le Grange, to Professor Matolino, thank you very much. I know you are very busy. Thank you for making yourself available, for preparing, for being such wonderful conversationalists in this webinar. I want to ask the panelists to just stay behind for a few minutes after we've ended the webinar. But I also I want to end by saying thank you to those wonderful people who always are behind the scenes to make these webinars and who have been there throughout the year. At Stellenbosch University, Alvandre Geland, our IT manager, who's always co-hosting the session today, our colleague Natasha Koltman, who stood in at MSU at Michigan State University, Beza Desta, the media event logistics and communication intern, who is also always helping with technical stuff, and also my counterpart, Dr. Upenyu Maji, for his wonderful support. And of course, to my colleague Geraldine Fraser, Dr. Friesler, who despite her own hectic webinar schedule of Just Conversations, is always willing to help and assist with the Ubuntu Dialogues webinars in different capacities. Thank you, Geraldine. So thank you very much. I wish all of you a productive last 2-3 weeks of the year, and a restful and regenerative holiday and festive season. Thank you very much to all of you who attended. Thank you.